Hi, good to be here. Hope everyone's having fun at Startup Week. I certainly am. I'm Mary Fernandes. I lead a company called Solus Agrosciences, which is a plant design and plant pipeline as a service company for ag tech innovators. And I'm happy to be here today. I'm a molecular biologist by training, and I spent over 2 decades at a large multinational corporation that I left earlier this year to found Solus. So the past 6 months have been a lot of fun, have been very busy, but it also led me to think deeply about certain differences between my prior world and my current world, the corporate world and startup world. And these can be pretty large differences. There's nothing intrinsically good or bad about either environment. They're just different. And as I was thinking about it, I decided that we need to talk more about this. I thought that we need to start a conversation on this. And if we want to build really strong ecosystems really for innovation, it's very important, I think, to have crosstalk between these two environments, between these two corporate and startup ecosystems. And so I just wanted to take a show of hands and see, are there people here who can identify with one or the other, startup world or corporate world here? Startup? Startup? Oh, everybody's startup. Corporate? Oh, 2 hands. I guess 2, 3, 4. Okay, so it's a good mix. I think maybe 60-40, you'd say? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So the thing with this is that everyone's so busy, in your own world, in these 2 verticals. You can get very siloed. And one of the things we don't often realize is we don't have awareness of the other's strengths and weaknesses and what we can learn from each other. And probably the only time we do this, we learn, is when we're, at a conference or, looking at a LinkedIn feed, and liking something. So I think that's important. Having this, that's the objective for today. Can we talk about these differences in sort of as a starting point for a more structured outreach, and what can we do as an ecosystem, especially in St. Louis, where you have large corporations like Pfizer and Bayer, and then you have a thriving ag and pharma startup ecosystem as well. And so as I started to think about this, I reached out to 3 really smart people that I knew.
Did you hear what she said? Are you paying attention?
And I will introduce them in a little bit, because I think it's important to have these conversations, and I couldn't think of any funner, more smart people than Chris Bethel, Tanya Seeger, and Alex Hermaki. And so we started chatting about it, and we're going to continue that conversation today. So let me start by introducing Chris. Chris is an experienced scientist. He's actually a senior investment analyst at Biogenerator, the startup arm of BioSTL. But he's an experienced scientist, and he's had a variety of different roles in many large companies: Pfizer, Merck, Sigma, Millipore, and Mallinckrodt. We're going to hear his perspectives on the topic I just shared with you. And then Tanya Seeger, she is currently the CEO of Plastomics, Plastomics, which is an ag company startup. But prior to that, she was the chief financial officer at Bayer Monsanto for the North America Seeds and Traits Division, for all of North America, really. So, you're looking at some real star power here. And Tanya was responsible for all the commercial launches of our products, of Bayer's products, and strategic planning as well. And then Alex, what can I say about Alex? Alex.
Loser.
Alex is the CTO of Impetus Ag, another startup. But prior to that, Alex has a background in IT. He was actually digital IT strategy lead at Monsanto and then at Bayer for a little while before he moved. And in that role, he was responsible for a lot of the digital strategy and transformation, IT transformation at Monsanto. So, with that little bit of a background there, let me turn over the mic to Chris. And maybe, Chris, if you could tell us a little bit about your journey. It's been a very varied journey, and share some of those highlights with us would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary, very much for the introduction. And this topic is super interesting to me, having experienced both startup cultures and corporate cultures in a lot of different companies. As Mary had mentioned, I originally started immediately out of my undergraduate working for Pfizer. And I was primarily a benchtop scientist. I ran a lot of assays. I did a lot of product development. I really wasn't involved with too many decisions or too many executive kind of concepts. A lot of it was just routine work over and over again to put out data packages to be able to support drug development. I used that experience actually spending a little bit of time at Monsanto, and then Mallinckrodt, and then Sigma Aldrich. About 8 years ago, I actually decided that I wanted something new, something that was more my own project, something that I could actually put my mark on. And I went and started applying to academia, as is often kind of one of these perceived paths. And some feedback I got said, well, you'd actually be a lot better in startups. And so I actually went over to a startup weekend event, which was associated with the St. Louis startup events. This was about 8 years ago at the building right over there. And met a company called ProArc Diagnostics, where we actually then started an in vitro diagnostic company, which I was doing on nights and weekends. This actually got my exposure to the innovation ecosystem and really got my career started within innovation and allowed me to pivot very hard from being this benchtop scientist doing routine work into really being in these innovative spaces. For the last 4 years, I actually worked for Millipore Sigma / Merck Darmstadt's Innovation Center, where I was an ideator, idea champion, and technology scout within the life sciences and biotech spaces. And now I'm back home where I started at BioGenerator, part of BioSTL, creating new companies here in St. Louis.
Thanks, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Tanya, would you like to share a little bit more about your journey?
So, Mary, yes, I've spent the last 15 years with Monsanto Bayer in various product development, commercial roles. Started out in R&D, actually leading the financial organization there. Unlike the folks here that have spoken, I don't have a science background, but I pretend pretty good. I obviously have a finance and strategy background. But yeah, so I spent most of my career in that executive room. And so a lot of different experiences and understanding from an influence, stakeholder, competing strategy perspective. Mm-hmm. And prior to that, I've always been excited about technology. I actually started my career in telecom when telecoms were bag phones and moved through that industry as we went through the consolidation into where we see them today. So how I landed here really is, you get to a point at the, latter stages of your career where you want to build on all those skill sets and experiences that you've developed. And through, again, networking, like you said, but my objective was, I would say, a little bit different. It was, how do I continue to give back to two things that I'm passionate about? And that's agriculture and the St. Louis area. Mm-hmm. So this was a pretty cool place for me to settle in and be able to contribute and feel like I'm still, very productive and engaged.
I have one. So, sure. Hey everybody, my name's Alex Fermacchi. I will test you on the spelling of my name after this presentation, or I guess this panel. So, Mary's introduction of me is a bit misleading, and I'll kind of go into that in a little bit more. So we're looking at going on a 30-year career arc that's a lot like the Lion King, sort of the circle of life, in that I started in the biotech world, went through 2 different pharmaceutical companies, or I should say in the biotech world, small and medium-sized, 2 pharmaceutical companies. I'm trained as a scientist, so I have a PhD in microbiology and immunology. And as she said, towards the end of that 30 years, or so I thought at the time, ended up at Monsanto as an IT strategy lead. And you may be asking yourselves, how the hell did he land that job? And I think as part of sharing that career arc with you and sort of the experience is, for me, it's always been about opportunity and trying to learn. And I know that sounds a bit cliche, but I love solving puzzles. And I think the thing that, in terms of giving back, what I like working with is with individuals who are looking to have that same experience, in that, sure, we get great training. Microbiology, immunology sounds very sophisticated. It's training. It actually teaches you how to think. And so I was able to apply all of those skill sets early on, and then moved into the big companies and the big pharma and realized I don't really know anything. I mean, small companies focus on delivering technology. It's really exciting. It's super sexy, and it sounds great, and we're going to make lots of money with stock, et cetera. And then when I would come to large companies, I'd be talking to individuals who'd been there for 20, 30 years, and I realized I know nothing about the product development process as it relates to pharmaceuticals. And then lo and behold, I end up working in the agricultural industry as an IT strategy lead, but learned a tremendous amount about the industry in terms of agriculture. And guess what? They're not that different, right? I mean, the company that I'm with now, Impetus Ag, is developing new products to enhance biopesticides. And what's interesting is the kind of studies that we do to prove that our technology works is, rather than trying to save the patient, we're killing the patient, right? We're killing the insects. Whereas before, when I was working in pharma, it was about saving people's lives. So I guess what I'm getting at is, Mary's point, maybe to reemphasize it, is they're the same. Industries are very similar. The types of skills you need to apply to those different industries. If you want to talk about user testing, yeah, I did IT, I understand it. I'm conversant in it. Now, it makes me a bit dangerous, but I think it's about creating an ecosystem where people are open to the opportunity. Meaning, if you work for a small company, oh, the evil big company. Not really. It's not that way. I mean, there's a lot to learn. There are extremely talented, knowledgeable people to leverage and learn a ton from. And on the flip side, the energy, the passion, all of the innovation that's on the small company side is super exciting. And so now, kind of my circle of life started in biotech. I'm back in biotech and working for a startup company.
Thanks for that. Where's the Lion King song here?
I'll hold up the baby. Okay.
All right. So when you think about, let's talk about some of the differences, right, between the two worlds, corporate, big corporations, and small. Well, obvious one is size, and startups are, is it because of the size that they're more agile and faster? What are the other differences? What would you say, Chris?
Sure.
What contributes to the speed and agility that startups have?
Yeah, so startups both are very mission focused, right?
Yeah.
Corporates and startups both are very mission focused, but the difference is what that mission is. Corporates often have franchises that they want to execute, that they want to get out into the market, that they want to drive down cost, right? To be able to just constantly iterate their product and make sure the product gets put into as many different things as possible. It's a very oversimplification, but really large corporates are about executing the plan that they actually have. Startups are more about focusing on a particular problem and disrupting particular markets. They're much more quick, much more agile, right? I like to think of it as like a cruise ship versus little support ships, right? That cruise ship's gonna get a lot of people exactly where you want them to be able to get to that final goal. It's gonna take a whole team and a whole lot of effort and a whole lot of resources, but it also takes an incredible, I can't understate the amount of effort it takes to steer that boat, to be able to move it off target, just even the smallest amount. It's almost an insurmountable goal. Whereas startups, you need that agility. You need to be able to move around quickly to be able to pivot to specific pain points because you're focused on one particular problem, not upon executing a plan.
Yep. So you're talking about like the franchise mode versus.
Yeah, and so a lot of that
the-
comes down to culture.
Yeah.
There's a great book out there by Safi Bacall called Loon Shots, where he breaks down this whole mentality. He uses the phrase phase transitions because he's a physicist, which I love as a scientist, but really there are these different cultural drivers that contribute to each of these different mindsets. And as we said before, there's nothing inherently invalid about one versus the other. They both have a lot of value, but it's about the application of these mentalities, of these mindsets, that actually give corporates versus startups very different roles.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it's just about having that awareness and then, you know, applying that and making those connections to get the awareness in the first place. Great book, Moonshots by Safi Bacall, highly recommended. So Tanya, what of that resonates with you, or would you want to pick up on some of that? Or
Well, I mean, the thing that I appreciate, obviously, about startups is the agility and the focus. You know, in a large company, I think the biggest thing that I dealt with was what I would term competing strategies. Although I think you do come into some of that in startups, so it's been an interesting journey. And when I mean competing strategies, it's, you know, your shareholders, maybe they have certain margin growth, they have certain revenue growth, and sometimes those things are mutually exclusive. So, and then you might have, you know, a sustainability play, right? You might have a cost reduction play. And so how do you grow the business while still containing costs? So a lot of those sort of competing priorities. And I think what I've found in the startup space is you have an idea, you're very focused on that idea, but you have to be open as that idea starts to evolve, or as you meet other people that maybe they want to invest in your company and they too have a different perspective or maybe a competing priority. How do you, as the founder or the leader, sort of manage all those shiny things, right? So that you stay on track, you're able to deliver. So for me, there's some parallels, I think, too.
true, yeah.
Okay, so I was kind of thinking while you guys were talking, because you didn't say what you were going to say when we were practicing.
We didn't practice, guys.
So to be maybe the contrarian here, to me, there's one single thing that differentiates large companies from small companies. It's money, period. Yeah. I think from that flows all the things that you've just heard described. And I may contradict my colleagues here on the panel, but I'm going to illustrate it with some examples. But let me just talk it through first. So what's the same? People. That's what makes companies work. Now you can say technology, that's sure. If you could automate your whole company, fantastic, but there's usually people who are doing that. But you're always going to have to deal with people, personalities, strategic differences, always. Networks, they exist in different ways, right? I think, Tanya, one thing you just brought up is, you know, shareholders. Small companies have shareholders. And in fact, their relationship with the company is sometimes far more intimate than shareholders of big companies. Small companies have boards of directors, scientific advisory boards. I have to deal with them. And so I think that's another piece. I think culture, yes, but both have them. They're different, but I would say even amongst large companies, having worked for several of them, different big companies have different cultures, yet they're big companies. And for sure, small companies are different and have cultures. So why do I say money? I think it's kind of obvious, right? The one thing I'll qualify with my statement is more is not necessarily better. More is simply more. And I'll give an example, and again, not to be contrarian to what was said earlier about pivoting quickly. Let's use the COVID example. 2 different companies developed COVID vaccines that are touted as the most successful ones out there. One was Moderna. Now, not a startup, granted, but a small company. And one is Pfizer that I used to work for. Pfizer pivoted huge numbers of people on their own dime because they had the money in order to deliver what's considered a successful COVID-19 vaccine. Hey, by the way, Moderna did the same thing. And Moderna, how did they do it though? Through funding from their investors, I'm sure, but there was a lot of government money that was put into it. And politics aside, good or bad, money was set aside and 2 different companies delivered a product, a similar product, both being very successful. What was the difference? Money. And if that smaller company hadn't had that money, it would only be Pfizer and maybe Johnson & Johnson that were going to deliver vaccines. So I think in a small company, the lack of money, the beauty of what you're hearing about working in a small company is it narrows your focus. You have to deliver. If you do not have a sense of urgency, you will not succeed. In a big company, you kind of relax a little bit. I mean, we've worked for big companies where people just like, oh, that guy's just hanging out, they're not doing anything.
They're coasting.
It's sort of what they're now calling, supposedly, this new phrase, quiet quitting.
Yeah.
We've seen quiet quitting. I know I have in my career, and we weren't calling it quiet quitting. We were calling it downright lazy, right? Like, why don't they fire that person, right? And so from my perspective, the money thing and the urgency on one side, and on the other side, you have more money. But with more money, you can do more rigor. You'll deliver a product. You will do R&D, you'll do development, and you will go to the clinic or however in the ag space, you'll deliver products, seed, you'll put it in the bag. Small company, unless you have money, you're not going there. You're going to develop a specific technology. So I'll stop there, but I think to me that is the big pivot point where maybe what I'll leave you with is both situations are not that different. They really aren't. Science, technology, got to deliver it. Products have to try to deliver. So all those things are the same. It's the scale, and that's driven by the money.
Yeah.
Alex, I do need to critique just a little bit.
Go for it, please.
Just because,
Feel free.
Pfizer did execute, and they did push it into the market through the clinical trials, which is not a small task. But the idea did not come from them. The idea came from a small startup called BioNTech.
Right.
And the startup actually did the initial proof of concept work and provided all of the necessary material. And when talking with colleagues or former colleagues who do still work at Pfizer, it's more of a tech transfer activity. They bring the technology directly from the German startup to the American pharmaceutical company to execute the plan. And so I do see what the points that you're making, but Pfizer didn't do it alone.
He's right, Alex. BioNTech was the loonshot nursery, right?
Yeah.
So that's fair. And if we're going to get into it,
That's fine.
let's get into it. I would say that if you're going to play that card, small companies get it from academia.
Sure, yeah.
So
Moderna got a
all I'm
ton-
getting at is that small companies
Yeah.
are not necessarily coming up with the innovation on their own.
Yeah.
They're coming
That's
up with
fair.
it from academia. So with big companies, I have seen where individuals there have innovated.
Yeah.
And you can call it drug repurposing. Viagra, not to offend anyone, is a classic example of it was invented at Pfizer and it morphed into a new compound. It was for blood pressure. And by the way, somebody in commercial said, ooh, here's a new market opportunity.
Curious
Should we try it?
side effect.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. But so I'm not, I agree with you really wholeheartedly, but I'm just saying innovation occurs everywhere, and that's where I think it's not really different. It's again, to me, it comes down to the volume and the money, what
yeah.
you can ultimately deliver.
No, you're right, Alex, because it's the money that drives the number of people you have, that drives the size that we were talking about, that then drives the middle management, that drives the bureaucracy and all of that in big companies. At the end of the day, it's really...
And I think you're raising the other side of it, which I didn't bring up, is right. More money isn't better, and it's not just about people losing focus. It's some of the things that you brought up, the competing strategies. And the idea that we can do everything. We can do every experiment. Well, do you really need to?
Correct.
No, you end up wasting money.
Right.
And then you just brought up a point, Mary, process. God help me how much process there was in big companies.
I know, we'll get to that.
Right? But
Yeah.
I'm just saying, so what Tanya was saying, it's a lot easier to get things done. Fewer people to have to deal
Yeah,
with. So,
process,
agreed.
agree, process can kill the soul. So I see that as 3 legs of the stool, right? Startups, big corporations, and academia. We're kind of glossing over academia now because we're just talking about industry here because this is startup week. Let's talk about, the business side of things, right? We'll get to the academics in another maybe panel later, but there's a lot to talk about that too, you know.
It wasn't my fault. You brought it up.
No, but those are three very important legs for innovation. Any innovation ecosystem needs those three legs. And the more they have crosstalk, the more they have awareness, you know, the better they can unleash innovation and grow, right? So let's talk about you know, your piece of advice that you might have, you know, that you might have shared to your corporate self, Tanya or Alex, or that you might have also shared, Chris, and also a piece of advice you might want to share with those currently that are thinking now, that are maybe new in corporate world. You know, what would you like to share now that you've moved into startup spaces? Yeah.
Sure, I'll start off. So the first thing I would probably tell myself is to just, you know, give it a shot. I think that's the biggest thing, is taking that first step, moving out of the safety of a corporate environment, of the corporate umbrella, the consistency of a corporate job, and being able to just step out and take that risk. You know, for many years, I was very frustrated by the process, by this kind of soul-sucking process of doing the same thing over and over and over again, which is incredibly valuable and incredibly important, but also not for me. For years, I toiled under that frustration, and I would tell myself, retrospectively, just to move a little more quickly, to get out there, to just make yourself available, and to go out there into these spaces, explore, be actively engaged. Because that's the only way you find opportunities, is by putting yourself out there and by making some of those opportunities. And yeah, sometimes it's going to eat into your free time, and sometimes you're going to have to make some sacrifices before being able to make it into your career. But it's entirely possible, especially in this day and age, to be able to tap into these ecosystems, to tap into these spaces that are being built all around us. And you know, that's how I would encourage people. Just take the risk.
I agree completely. Tanya?
Yeah, for me, I think it's about networks, right? So when you grow up in a large organization, the folks that you have to influence and work through, they all reside within those four walls, so to speak. I would really advise folks that are in the corporate space not to restrain themselves to those four walls. Agriculture is, I always say, a very small, large business. There's honestly just a few players that are in it, and okay, I know all of them. Whoop-de-doo, right? What good does that do me to, you know, honestly go raise money, right, for a startup kind of thing? Because those players are different. They might know some of the same people I knew, but they're different people.
Right.
And I do think that there's huge benefit to having that network outside of those four walls, just because it enlightens you to what's going on in your environment that isn't inside those four walls. And I think that you miss out, to your point, on opportunities that can grow you personally. Whether that's, you know, to give back or to expand, or what you might want to do when you reach your plateau. Because within a large organization, you know, your career's like a pyramid. Well, in a large organization, most people hit at the middle 1/3 of the pyramid, right? Those that get over the half point or into the upper 1/3 are pretty far and few between, right? They're like 1 or 2% of who start there. So being able to expand that network beyond enables you to go beyond that pyramid, and startups are obviously at the top of their pyramid. So
a much smaller pyramid.
yeah, it's just a smaller pyramid, right? But it gives you more opportunities.
And that's so much true even for, you know, true everywhere, and in every industry. But when you look at the gender inequality, the top of the pyramid, you know, it's so small. So women, you know, are really getting a big hit in the pyramid.
Yeah.
Oh, and now the old white guy gets to talk. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's great. Thanks for that segue, Mary.
Did I say white?
No, I'm just saying. Diversity right here. Diversity of thought, how about that?
Okay.
So I think, okay, so I went from small companies to a large company. So now if I was going to give advice, and I've mentioned this previously, to my biotech self going into a large company, you don't know much. I think, and so to me, the opportunity is learning. And what they said is true. So learning can be doing work, and learning is networking, talking to experienced people. As I mentioned, people who've been at it for 20 to 30 years, tremendous amount. Because every time I would walk in with a new idea, thinking I was just the shine on the shine,
Yeah.
they would say, yep, we've done that before, it didn't work. And I go, wait, but we're gonna do it differently. And then they would drill down on it, and they'd go, no, it didn't work. And guess what? They ended up being right, it didn't work. Now, there was a few times, sure, we got lucky, and I can tell those stories later, but I think it's about being open to learning and not closing your mind off in like the opposite way of the bubble, to say, wow, innovation, it's awesome, you can do whatever you want. Yeah, kind of, but in order to be successful and deliver a product, which is what most companies are trying to do, whether it's an IT application or drug, a new seed product, whatever it might be, the intent is to deliver a product to make your company sustainable because you're in business to make money. On the flip side, coming from a big company, I'm going to echo the bubble. And again, what was said earlier about opportunity in the smaller company space, and what I'm trying to encourage folks to consider as I recruit them to our company, is don't be so myopic to think it has to be in a certain area, because there's opportunity. And I'll give an example. We recently hired an individual who came to St. Louis right out of graduate school, sound familiar, and wanted to work in industry. And she took a job with a local company that unfortunately recently had to close up shop. And being the opportunist, within a day I had her resume, she had the skill set that we desperately needed. I interviewed her, and I think 2 days later we hired her. Having said that though, here was the statement that her mother made to her, and she was like, I've never seen you so excited about working for a company, and it's in ag. I thought you wanted to work in pharma. And so my point to myself coming out of a big company into a small company is it's about using what you've learned. And by the way, you can apply it anywhere. I was the IT strategy lead for a, almost 1,000-person organization to do their digital transformation, and I'm a microbiologist and an immunologist, right? But at the same time, it's how you work with people, how you organize them, how you, again, use your skill set and apply it to convince people this is the way you need to move. So I think there's the opportunity that I would say to my big self, and lo and behold, I'm here, or big pharma self, or big ag self coming into this space. I'm having to leverage everything to now build a company from the ground up, and it's super exciting. And luckily, I have folks like this that I can tap into the network, right, to really help make that go.
Oh, great. So I think there's great insights, right, from, participating in the ecosystem, from thinking about learning from a learning perspective. What about risk and risk? Alex, you're smiling. So, employment security can breed a sense of complacency, right? But it's important, I think, to learn the risks, be aware of the risks, and everybody's personal risk profile is different, understood. But there are times in your life when you can take certain risks, and there are other times you can't. But being open to the risks, you can't be open to the risks if you don't know what the risks are. Alex, you want to talk a little bit about that, because you're smiling.
Yeah. So I would say sort of the conventional wisdom, if I can speak for conventional wisdom, is startup world, high risk. High reward, high risk. Big companies, it's not so risky. I'm all about examples, so let's talk about a big company. I was part of a site in Kalamazoo, Michigan that was part of Pharmacia. I went there thinking, and I came from the Bay Area, so now I never saw snow, now I'm seeing snow. Way more than I ever expected, but exciting job. I'm going to be here forever. I'm talking to people, I just told you, 20, 30 years at the company, no problem. Within a year and a half, they were acquired by Pfizer, and the entire site was shut down. People's lives were completely changed. Couples got divorced because they couldn't stay in the same area, all different kinds of things. I would come home every day with my jaw clenched so tight I couldn't talk because it was so tight. So big company, no risk, right? It's easy. There's risk associated with it. But I will admit, there is a perception that with going with a small company, there's more risk. And this is where I'm going to really start touting this ecosystem. Tanya and I were talking about this before we came in. This area has changed tremendously. I was an entrepreneur in residence probably almost 10 years ago as part of that career arc, and none of this was here. And I think there has to be a recognition by folks that there is a huge opportunity here. And once you're in the system, and I'm going to qualify it, and you are good, you can stay in the system. I just told you a story about somebody who was going to work in the pharmaceutical industry and is now working in ag. Who would have thunk it? Opportunity. Yeah. So I think for me, again, it's all the same. I agree with Mary. It's a perception of risk tolerance. And yet, hey, we're here. We're doing pretty well. There's plenty of companies out there that could potentially use our skills. Don't walk away from that just because you perceive that there's greater security in a larger company. There is, in part, but there's a lot of excitement. And I would say job satisfaction sometimes outweighs kind of that risk tolerance. I work harder now than I've worked probably in the last decade of my career. And I thought I worked hard.
Didn't we all?
Right? But it's fun. And my wife tells me every day, I've never seen you so excited about what you're doing. Spot on.
That is so true. So for anyone in corporate land that's listening, you heard, having an open mind, thinking differently about risk, just getting out there and participating, learning what, what's happening in the world outside can make a huge difference. Just avoiding those blind spots. And you're so right, Alex, about the ecosystem we have here.
I love it when you say that. I really do.
I should say that more often. You're right.
Probably you should.
I
struggle with that sometimes.
Note to self, praise Alex. So I think you're so right. I think there's so many opportunities here. I personally also am an executive in residence at Biogenerator, and I've seen the huge difference that BioSTL and Biogenerator have made, in the community, because whatever profits they get, they plow back into the system. And there are so many other institutions that are helping or trying to help. Even VC funding. One of my pet peeves is we don't have enough women in VC world, but maybe 2%. But again, that's changing, and we need more women. That's one of the reasons I'm here, because I want to promote that. That's one of the reasons why Tanya's here, right?
The CEO of Impetus.
So I think, yes, we have a long way to go, but, we're making progress, and we need more people to be thinking and cross-pollinating and having these conversations so that we're not siloed in one-way streets, right? Okay, so let's talk about, what advice might y'all have for startup founders or employees in startup space? Again, you want to go, Chris? Maybe.
Sure. So founders or employees within startup space, I think it's important to recognize that the skill set that is coming from people who are in corporates may be different, but it's still very useful, right? And so just like people who are coming from a corporate environment need to be able to step into the startup environment, also recognize you can, from a startup perspective, you can learn a lot from the established corporates, right? When I was in a corporate environment, yes, I was doing a lot of mundane, repetitive tasks, but I was also constantly curious. I was out there making sure, I'm testing this monoclonal antibody that's against this specific target. Why would they go after that target? What is interesting about that? And I would take the extra time to investigate that, to learn that. So not only do I know the technical skills to be able to execute the necessary tests, but I also know the exact strategy and the exact reasoning behind that. And then when I step into the startup space, I know some of that corporate mindset that allows for them to execute the plan to be able to drive these products into market. The key things that Pfizer brought to the BioNTech relationship, being able to push products into the market, being able to open up those market spaces. Those are things that are well beyond the scope of most startups, and yet the corporates do that all of the time, right? And so it's not, they're not they are different spaces with different mentalities,
Yeah.
but they are synergistic fundamentally in a lot of very important ways.
Yeah, no, that's so important, that learning to scale, you know. There's a lot that you can learn from big companies about what they've learned in the learning to scale process, you know, and what to do, what not to do.
Corporates are really great at process,
Yes.
being able to do something repeatedly over and over again. That's how they really extract as much value out of their products, is by iterating the process, going through 5S or 6 Sigma or whatever, like lean mentality to be able to extract every single drop of value out of a product. Corporates or startups aren't doing that necessarily, but they can still benefit from those skill sets.
Tanya, you want to add to that?
Sure. Well, in my role, it's really a focus of how we take it from science through to commercialization. And I think the big learning that I've seen there from a startup perspective is not understanding the structure, the decision-making, the influencing that goes on within some of these potential acquirers or collaborators that are corporate structures, right? So it's very easy to think that the process or the path to decision-making within those places is linear, very simple. And we've been having a lot of conversation within our team right now because we do a lot of business with these multinationals. And unfortunately, it's not linear at all. You have to come at them from multiple places. So being able to understand who are the influencers, but more importantly, what's the story that resonates with them? One, it might be science and very technical, but another doesn't understand that science piece. They need to understand, how am I going to make money? How am I going to satisfy my customer? So being able to develop both of those stories and find the right people to influence them, I think is really the startup advice, right?
Yeah,
That we learn from
that's
corporate.
such great advice. Alex, want to add to that or share your perspective?
Yeah, I guess I'll use a thing that maybe you guys have heard. So for startups, minimum viable product. Figure it out. You figure out minimum viable product, that will take you a long way. Because again, it focuses and really makes you, I hate to say myopic, but it really focuses you in on what you need to deliver. I like where Tanya's going because it's very challenging when you're trying to interact with big companies. The advantage that we have here, all of us on this panel, is we have connections into those companies, so it makes it a little bit easier, but oftentimes those people aren't the decision makers, so it's still an influence piece. But why I'm bringing that up is when you're meeting with strategics, if I was going to give an advice to a new company, when you're meeting with strategics and or you're meeting with investors, ask them. Ask them, say, what do you think we need for a minimum viable product? What makes sense to you? Because by the way, they're not going to buy it from you unless they believe that you've met their criteria. Ask them. I mean, it's a conversation, and it is a way of networking and influencing because it makes them realize that as a potential partner, you're open to their way of thinking and their experience to help you deliver minimum viable product.
Oh, that's very good insight. I didn't stop to ask if there were questions in the middle of our conversation to please chime in. We'll have some time at the end, but feel free to raise your hand. We're happy to entertain any questions you have, right?
Or comments for
or
that matter.
comments, really, because this is a discussion, it's a conversation, really. So, I was thinking about all the stuff you said, process, the decision making and the reaching out to different levels and layers of people in organizations and what you talked about too, Alex. And one of the things that struck me is the complete, almost complete lack of awareness a lot of folks in startup land have of regulatory implications, for example, or legal implications. It can be a little loosey-goosey, and I think there's there's a middle ground there, obviously, you know, between excessive process and bureaucracy and just the other extreme. But I think that's another area. It could fall under process, but those are two specific things I've really come to realize. You know, people coming in from a big company environment have those antenna out, you know, and can immediately say, well, what about this? You know, have you thought of that? You know, before you put this out in the field or before you know, sign that agreement.
There's this really common mantra in startups of you move fast and break things, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, when you're working in regulated areas, when you break things, people's lives are sometimes on the line.
Correct.
Just look at Theranos, right? You should not have just been acting as if you were completely unregulated, and there is some advantages to that.
Yeah.
And corporates are super fast or super focused on how is this going to get the regulation? How am I going to get to market? Because that is a major market barrier for a lot of the spaces that we actively
Right.
develop products in this ecosystem.
Yep, yep.
I guess the other thing I was thinking is I'm going to invoke the fourth leg, the government.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay,
So I
good
think,
point. Yeah.
you know, ideas emanate from academic institutions. How many times do you hear those stories and it's all legit? Biotech companies will take them on and develop them to a certain point, and then, despite my colleagues, like, oh, they just do acquisition. They do, but there are smart scientists who go, you know what, that could be a product. We're going to tap into that company and we're going to pull that technology in and we're going to industrialize it to deliver it. But I think Mary's bringing up a really valid point. I can talk about minimum viable product. It's viable product. It's not a product until the government approves it. And I think one of the things that you learn in a big company when you start those conversations, the number of times I heard individuals in the regulatory space say, start the conversation now with
Before.
regulators in order to set the stage for whatever your product that's coming. Because if you hit them cold and they've never heard about something like that before,
The answer's
it's
no.
very tough.
Yeah.
It's very tough to get something approved. So I think that's a significant space too.
Well, that's a very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So we move from a three-legged stool to a chair now, which is a very, very important
I'm
point.
working on the sofa, but
Yeah, yeah. But, you know, so it's just, and this is agnostic to industry because it doesn't matter if you're in pharma and making medicines and regulation is important, or if you're putting a transgenic out in the field. You know, even a company like Uber, you know, has to deal with regulation and in this governments. Yes,
Yeah, I'd like to follow on Alex's comment.
Did you want a mic here?
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, following up on Alex's comment about the fourth leg, which is regulatory, there's also a fifth leg,
Oh, here we go. The
which is
sofa.
I told you the sofa's
It's coming.
reimbursement. Okay, think of like Biogen with their price on their Aduhelm or whatever for Alzheimer's. It was just an incredible price, and you wonder if it's just pulled out of the air. But it's something certainly to consider even at an early stage.
Yeah, good point. So what suggestions should we throw out for folks to increase awareness in this cross-pollination, you know, between the two sectors, if you will? You feel free to share more than one if you have thoughts. Go. You want to go?
Hand off to other people first.
Okay.
I want to start. Come talk to me.
Yeah.
We're looking to hire people. I'm looking to meet people who have the skill set that we need. And that's a bit tongue-in-cheek. But at the same time, given what you've heard here today, stop with people like this in these kinds of roles and get out there and ask questions and inquire. Give them your name, take their card, email them. Say, hey, look, I'm interested in XYZ PDQ. Can you either help me or can you connect me with someone? It goes back to Tanya's point about networking kind of the other way, not within a big company, but within the ecosystem. Because without those connections, I would have never hired that person I described earlier. It just wouldn't have happened. They would have just been out there, they just lost their job, and they had no idea what they were gonna do. They just rented a house. I mean, all the pressures, right? We talked about risk. And lo and behold, this crazy guy comes by and says, hey, do you want to have lunch together? And within 2 days, you're offered a new job. That doesn't happen without putting yourself out there and having the conversation and having those connections. So if you're familiar with any kind of, familiarize yourself, I'll say, with a lot of the events that are shared by either Biogenerator, Danforth, career days, whatever they might be. If you're working in a big company, take an afternoon off, take a lunch off and go check it out. If you're working in a small company or coming out of academia, start looking into that stuff. I'm not as tech savvy in terms of social media, but there's stuff that's posted all the time.
Yeah.
Take advantage of that, because you get yourself out there and you talk to people, you start to learn what you don't know. And believe me, guys, there's a lot, we don't know what we don't know. So that would be kind of my pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would even be as bold to say, think like a recruiter, right? Don't be afraid to cold call into some of these big companies. Remember that pyramid story I told you where a lot of these folks cap out at the third of the bottom of the pyramid? Well, unfortunately, in a large company, they're also just waiting for a manager within that company to tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, would you be interested in this job? And 9 times out of 10, it's a lateral.
Yeah.
So your cold call is probably more flattering to them than you might know, and they are very aware of that tap out, if you want to call it that. So don't be afraid to do that cold call. And then I would say, to expand on what you were talking about, really think out of the box about where you can meet people, right? Toastmasters. I
Right.
mean, the golf course, right? But don't just share
Can't do that in
beer.
the startup world anymore. With golf course.
You have to do it on your own dime,
Okay.
right? Okay, soccer clubs with your kids, whatever it might be. But my point is, go places where the general public
Yeah.
go, or LinkedIn is such a
Great place
great
to-
creeper place, right? It's
Yeah.
just like Facebook, where you can creep people and figure out what they're interested in. I'm serious, right?
You're right.
But that's
true.
a tool that wasn't there when I started my career looking for folks, right?
Yeah.
But use it as the creeper opportunity that it is, and figure out how you go and meet different people or cold call to them. Because,
A window into
I've
Tanya's
done some of
mind.
that, but you have to think like
Yeah.
a recruiter. That's how a hardcore headhunter thinks, right? And so, a little bit,
And
that's
then
how you
make
have
the
to think.
time, right? Because you have to make the time, because everybody's busy. You'll be, pipetting, or you'll be, at that computer, for the next week, next month, next year. But you won't make the time unless you decide to make the time to go to one of these things. And to Alex's point about, attending some of these events, one thing I might throw out is for places like Venture Cafe and others to, bring those events to corporate land, right? It's easier, that's where you have, a very, population there that might be eager to learn about what's going on. It's a very simple thing to do. They're less likely to come to startup land, right? But if you bring yourself there, it's like, Muhammad going to the, it's the same thing.
But I would say encourage others, right?
Yeah.
For me, if someone's not interested, but you know of someone who's interested, I have a friend, kind of a deal. Encourage them. I mean, if you hear about it, pass it along, because it really is all about people and communication. And too often, in our world, in the small startup world, and in large companies, like we've already said multiple times, you can get in that bubble and really focused on what you're doing, to the ignoring all the rest around you, which is important, right? Because you have to deliver. But at the same time, sometimes like peeking up your head and taking a breath and going, hey, maybe there's a different opportunity for me, or maybe there's someone I know who, by the way, hey everybody, anyone who can help me out, please, come up and talk to me. And if you have friends in particular areas of interest, I will share them with you. But that's my point. It's a recruiting thing, right? Talk to people.
And we all have jobs open, by the way, so
Sorry.
come talk to any of us.
But
No, just me.
First, my name's
Competition.
again,
Ken, and I love the synergy between the four of you guys. I think you guys know each other pretty well. Can I assume that all four of you are currently classified as in startups?
I'm not.
He's not.
Okay. One of the questions that I'm not in the ag wheelhouse, so it's totally new and interesting. And Tanya came up with the statement that you are in one of the smallest, largest industries out there. And we were talking about startups as one silo. We were also talking about corporate as the other silo. In most industries, there's a large gap in between for small and medium companies. I'm curious, with your startups, is your mission or vision to sell to a large corporate? Are you trying to be the next large corporate and increasing it? Or are you trying to be a middle company, which is one of the questions with startups?
Great question.
Our mission is very clear. What we're developing can really only be brought to scale by a large ag entity. So being able to network with them, collaborate with them is important. Now, there's also small companies that we can provide proof of concepts to that, again, need some of these larger companies to bring to scale. But it's more about, when you can have multiple proof of concepts with unique genes, right, that gets them enticed. So yeah, you got to kind of understand both of them, but it's just one of the largest, smallest industries around, right? I would tell you, having grown the first half of my career in telecom, it's the exact same thing. And I think it's because of consolidation to a large part. To your point, there's a lot of small mediums that feed into it or take market share that is very peripheral. But at the end of the day, in these types of industries where consolidation is where it's gone because of the R&D and technology component, that's why you sort of, I get blown away how I run across the same people in different spaces where they bounce between those small, medium, and larges. But it's rare to find a new player sometimes. It's really weird.
I wanted to add a couple thoughts on that. So, a lot of the companies that we're talking about are in fact VC backed, and VC wants 10x return, right? Whatever you can get, though, is ultimately what the company is going to be driving towards. And so a lot of companies will come in and say, I'm structuring this to be an IPO, and we have a platform technology, and therefore we plan on doing an independent public offering, and we want to directly compete with the big companies. That's not realistic for every single company. Some companies will create these mid-tier products that offer more services to larger companies or smaller companies. Some will be aiming to be acquired, right? But all of these companies, I think, need to be flexible enough to be opportunistic, to be able to step into these spaces and say, yeah, maybe we're aiming for IPO, but if a big corporate offers to buy us, we'll take the exit, right? And I think any clear-sighted entrepreneur going into these spaces will recognize that we'll take the opportunities as they present.
I don't know if I'm adding much, maybe I'm just repeating. I think the short answer to your question is yes. And so for me, the pivot I would do maybe is shareholder value and minimum viable product. So from my perspective, where we are in a bridge round, a lot of angel investors, we haven't gone into the VC space, not for the lack of trying, but I think it's delivering shareholder value for those people who've invested us in the seed round, and that some of them have now repeated in the bridge round. And the reason why I say yes is exactly what was just said. It's what's the opportunity. I've seen plenty of companies who say, as was just mentioned, IPO, they never get there. But they keep a company going forever. I mean, they'll get funding upon funding upon funding, and they end up just building a company, but it's a company, it's not a product delivering company. I've also seen folks go in and say, we're gonna exit, and we're gonna exit early, and we're gonna deliver on technology, and it never happens. In fact, they jinx themselves most of the time. So that's where I think for us, and I'll speak for Impetus, yes, the current strategy is early exit for the same reasons that Tanya said we'll never get there. But we're not giving up on that. I mean, I think we have collaborators who could help us, but what if it bails? If we want to deliver that minimum viable product and we want to be a successful company for our shareholders who've taken their risk in investing in us, we could go, and in ag, I think it's bigger than it is, in fact, in my opinion, in the pharma space, is you do have all three scopes. I mean, you have big seed companies, You have the Bayers, the Bayers, the Cortevas, we can name a bunch of them. You have a lot of small companies. Obviously, this is the ecosystem now that's trying to drive that, or we'll say Research Park in North Carolina is just another example, right? But there's a lot of medium companies. And when I came into ag, I wasn't like the Wilbur Ellis's, et cetera. Like these are guys are tweeners between the big and the small that can leverage what the small company brings. It's not going to sell on the same scale, right? But they're also providing that gap product for farmers that the bigger companies aren't going to be providing because it doesn't make any sense for them economically. So the answer is yes. If it gives shareholder value one way or another, we could be Benson Hill, go public. Or we could be Covercrest, bought out by Bayer. I think our investors would take either one, right? A darling unicorn that took off and made investors a bunch of money if they got in at the right time. Another company that made a lot of founders very wealthy, but also their investors got a return on their investment. So I'm just embellishing what they've said. But I think from that perspective, if you go into a company just like, we're going to do this or we're going to do this, you're going to fail. Because you have to be opportunistic. You have to say, if something presents itself, if Bayer came tomorrow and said, we'll buy your technology for $100 million, look at me and tell me if I walked away from that deal, okay? Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. But by the way, for the technology that we have, that's kind of what I'm banking on. They're telling us, board of directors member said, you deliver this, that's a $100 million deal with a big company. Music to my ears, minimum viable product. You have to deliver it. So that's the key.
Does that answer your question, Ken?
Yeah, it was more of a exploratory to see.
Yeah, I think.
One of the problems,
Yeah.
one of the problems I see with most startups is they have a vision and a passion for a product or an idea, but they don't spend the time to understand the marketplace and the niche they're in and how much growth is there. That if there are only 4 or 5 big players, and we're talking about corporate versus startup, you need to understand, are you going to sell out or sell to the corporate, or are you going to have a set on you and you're going to take them on full force and see if you can outbeat them with niche technology that they can't compete with on a speed base?
Yep. I think it's very important to start your startup with the exit strategy in mind. So I would agree with that. So I think we're at the end now. We're going to wrap up, but hopefully what we've discussed here has given you all some food for thought. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Like Alex said, not just Impetus, but Solus and Plastomics and also Biogenerator have open positions, BioSTL, so feel free to reach out to any of us at any time. I think the important thing is whether you're an employee in startup world or in corporate land, the important thing is that you're advancing in your career, you're fulfilling your aspirations, you don't necessarily have to go up the ladder, but you need to be doing meaningful work. And I think that's very important from a personal perspective for most of us, right? So hopefully this was helpful, and we encourage you to continue the conversation online or in other spaces. Thank you. And thank you, Tanya, Chris, and Alex.
Thank you.